On the afternoon of the 25th of April 2007, a 25-year-old police officer named Martin Arnold and his partner Michelle were sitting in their police cruiser. They were parked in the lot of a public park in a city called Heilbronn in Germany. It was their lunch break. Martin was eating a sandwich, casually looking out across the park. The space was mostly empty, which made sense. It was a weekday afternoon, and most people were at work or school. Heilbronn was a medium-sized city in southern Germany, and for the most part, it was a pretty safe place to live. The worst crimes they usually dealt with were things like break-ins or the occasional mugging. So, for Martin and his partner, it was a pretty quiet day. There wasn't a whole lot of action happening around them. But there was something that Martin, Michelle, and basically every other police officer in Germany were constantly aware of. For the past 14 years, a whole series of crimes had been happening all across the country. These crimes range from simple home invasions and robberies to at least 2 brutal murders. And according to the DNA evidence collected at each scene, they had all been committed by the same person. It was a single woman, and the press had given her a nickname. They called her the woman with no face. For over a decade, she had managed to evade capture. And so, in a way, every police officer in Germany was always on the lookout for her. She was the most elusive, most sought-after criminal in the entire country. But on this particular afternoon, as Martin sat in his cruiser on his lunch break, he wasn't really thinking about the possibility of capturing the woman with no face. He was just thinking about his sandwich. He was about to take another bite when he heard a sound that made him freeze. It was the sound of the back doors of his cruiser opening. He whipped his head around to look, and what he saw sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. There were 2 people standing there, one at each of the open back doors, and each of them was holding a gun. Before Martin or Michelle could even process what was happening, before they could reach for their own weapons or even shout, the 2 people raised their guns. They fired. And for Martin, everything went black. Within minutes, the quiet park was swarming with police. Officers from the Heilbronn Police Department descended on the scene, their sirens cutting through the afternoon calm. They found Michelle first. She was deceased, killed by a single gunshot wound to the head. Then they saw Martin. He had also been shot in the head, but incredibly, he was still alive. He was unconscious, but breathing. An ambulance was called immediately, and paramedics rushed him to the hospital while detectives began the painstaking work of taping off the crime scene and looking for any piece of evidence they could find. Some of the officers started canvassing the area, going from bench to bench, path to path, hoping to find a witness. But it was no use. The park had been basically empty all day. There was nobody who had seen the shooting happen. Other officers got on their hands and knees, meticulously searching the ground around the police cruiser. They were looking for footprints, anything that might tell them which direction the shooters came from or where they went. They dusted the car for fingerprints, hoping for a stray print on a door handle or a window. They searched inside and outside the car for bullet casings, for hairs, for loose fibers from clothing, but there was nothing. It was as if the attackers had been ghosts. At this point, the investigators were completely stumped. All they knew for sure was that at least one shooter, maybe more, had managed to walk up to a marked police cruiser in broad daylight, completely undetected. They had opened the back doors, shot both officers in the head at point-blank range, and then vanished without leaving a single obvious trace behind. It seemed impossible. The investigators kept thinking they must have missed something. There had to be some small clue, something that could point them in the right direction, give them a lead on who was responsible for this brazen attack. In a last-ditch effort to find something, anything, at the crime scene, one of the forensic officers decided to swab the inside of the car for potential DNA evidence. It was a long shot. They knew that if they found any DNA, it could easily belong to Martin or Michelle. Or it could belong to anyone else who had recently been in the back of that cruiser. It didn't mean the DNA would belong to the shooters. But it was possible. It was their only shot. They wouldn't know if the sample was useful until the crime lab analyzed the swabs, and that process could take a very long time. But it was worth a try. And so they carefully packaged the swabs and sent them off for testing. While they waited for the DNA results to come back, the Heilbronn Police Department continued to work the case. They re-interviewed everyone who worked in or lived near the park. They checked traffic cameras. They followed up on every tiny tip that came in, but they kept coming up empty. Their only real potential witness was Martin himself, but he was still in a deep coma at the hospital, unable to tell them what he saw. Weeks turned into a month. The case was growing colder by the day. And then, finally, the police got the news they had been waiting for. The DNA results from the lab were in. And what those results revealed was so stunning that it sent the media into an absolute frenzy and instantly turned this local investigation into a national manhunt. Around this same time, in mid-2007, a 44-year-old German prosecutor named Gunter Horn was sitting in his office. He got a call from his boss, and his boss's voice was urgent. He said, "The woman without a face has struck again." This time in Heilbronn. Gunter's eyes went wide. He sat up straight in his chair and listened intently as his boss laid out the details. 2 police officers had been ambushed in their cruiser. One was dead, the other in a coma. And in the back seat of their car, forensics had found DNA. The DNA of the woman with no face. Gunter had always been fascinated by this particular case. The story of the woman without a face was legendary in German law enforcement circles. And so, he was beyond ecstatic when his boss asked if he, Gunter, would be willing to lead the investigation into this latest crime in Heilbronn. His new mission was not just to solve the shooting of the 2 officers, but to finally, once and for all, identify and capture this phantom killer. Gunter immediately said yes. He would do it. And he got to work right away. The first thing Gunter did was organize a special task force to investigate the woman without a face. The team was based in Heilbronn, but their scope was national. At Gunter's command, detectives on the team began a massive undertaking. They started reinvestigating all the old crimes from all over Germany that had been linked to this woman's DNA. They were looking for patterns, for overlooked evidence, for witnesses that might have been missed during the original investigations years ago. Through this exhaustive effort, the team started to build a rough profile of their suspect. They knew she was very likely a heroin user because police had once recovered a heroin needle with her DNA on it at a public park. They also knew she had extensive criminal contacts. Many of her crimes involved co-conspirators. But whenever police had managed to arrest and interrogate these co-conspirators, none of them would ever say a word about her. It was like they were terrified of her, loyal to her out of fear. There were a couple of other details that struck Gunter as being particularly odd. The first was the evidence itself. In 16 years of criminal activity, the only piece of evidence this woman had ever left behind at any of her dozens of crime scenes was her DNA. And since they didn't have a match for her in any database, they only knew she was a woman. They had no idea who she was. She had never left a single fingerprint. Not a footprint. Not a hair. Nothing else. It seemed like her crimes were incredibly deliberate, surgically clean, and meticulously planned. And yet, she was also consistently leaving behind her DNA. It was almost as if she was leaving it on purpose, like a calling card to taunt the police. The other strange thing Gunter and his task force discovered was that in many of the crimes committed by the woman without a face, witnesses had described seeing what looked like a man at the scene, not a woman. This was obviously weird. Based on the DNA evidence, they knew, unequivocally, that their suspect was biologically female. So Gunter had a couple of theories. Maybe this man seen at the crime scenes was just one of the woman's many co-conspirators. Or maybe the woman without a face was so cunning that she dressed as a man to avoid being identified and caught. But it was impossible to know for sure without a first-hand witness, someone who had actually seen the suspect up close. That was what Gunter really needed. And then, in late May, about a month after the shooting in Heilbronn, Gunter got a call about that exact type of witness he had been looking for. Later that same day, Gunter walked into a hospital in Heilbronn. He went to a specific room and saw police officer Martin Arnold lying in a hospital bed. His eyes were open. After being in a coma for a month, he had finally woken up. Gunter knew that Martin was his best, and maybe his only, chance of catching the woman without a face. Presumably, right before he was shot, he must have gotten a look at his attackers. He was the one witness who might finally be able to describe her. Gunter walked over, pulled up a chair next to Martin's hospital bed, and he gently asked him to please just tell him everything he remembered about what happened that day in the park. Martin was clearly distraught. He had just woken up from a coma to learn that his partner and friend, Michelle, was gone. He was emotional, trying to process his own injuries and her death, but he tried his best to help Gunter. He told him that, realistically, he couldn't remember what happened. He remembered hearing the doors open, turning around, seeing two figures. But after he was shot, it was like his memory of the event was just wiped clean. He had almost nothing to offer the investigation. And just like that, Gunter was back to square one. For the next 2 years, Gunter and his task force worked tirelessly to try to catch the woman without a face. They spent millions of euros. They clocked thousands upon thousands of hours of overtime. They even offered a massive reward equivalent to 400,000 American dollars for any information that could lead to her capture. But none of it led anywhere. And adding insult to injury was the fact that while this massive investigation was going on, the woman without a face just kept committing crimes. The task force connected her DNA to at least 6 more break-ins, 1 more robbery, and another murder. And her crimes weren't just happening in Germany anymore. They also found the woman's DNA at crime scenes in France and in Austria. The entire region was now on high alert for this woman who seemed to be an impossibly cunning international criminal genius. And Gunter, after all this time and all this effort, couldn't help but start to wonder if he would ever be able to catch her. But then, in March of 2009, Gunter got a call from a police officer in France. And what this officer told him would change everything. The officer explained that the French police were currently investigating a potential murder. A badly burned body had been found, so disfigured that for a while all police knew was that the victim was a man. However, an asylum seeker who had recently come to France had been reported missing, and the police wondered if maybe the body belonged to him. So, on a hunch, they had gotten his asylum application paperwork. That paperwork included his official fingerprints. The investigators had been able to lift a DNA profile from the ink on those prints, but when they got the DNA analyzed, the results made absolutely no sense. The French police were so baffled by what they found that they knew they had to call Gunter. They knew that if anyone in Europe needed to know about this bizarre DNA result, it was him. Gunter listened as the officer filled him in on the baffling results they had found. At first, he was just as confused as they were. But at the same time, he felt a new surge of hope. To him, it felt like, as bizarre as this new information was, maybe this was the break he had been looking for the past 2 years. Maybe this was the clue that would finally allow him to figure out who this woman really was. He thanked the French police officer for the call and immediately brought this new information to his team. Within just a few days, this new information from France did in fact lead Gunter and his team directly to the woman with no face. It would turn out that this woman, the international criminal mastermind behind dozens of crimes, including at least 4 murders, who had evaded capture for 16 years all across Germany and beyond, appeared to everyone who actually knew her as a completely normal person. No one would have ever suspected she was responsible for all these horrible crimes. She was a young woman who lived in southern Germany. During the day, she worked at a factory. At night, she just went home. She lived a very ordinary, unremarkable life. And so, again, nobody ever suspected her. But what the French police found when they analyzed the DNA from the missing man's asylum application was that the man's fingerprints on the paper somehow contained this woman's DNA. This was clearly impossible. The man was biologically male, and the woman without a face was biologically female. They knew that for a fact. So even if the asylum seeker had secretly been this woman in disguise, that wasn't physically possible. And when the French police saw this impossible result, they knew they had to tell Gunter. When Gunter and his team looked into this, they finally figured out the shocking truth. It was precisely this woman's normal-seeming life, and in particular her very normal-seeming job at the factory, that made everything possible. Because at this factory, this woman sat on an assembly line helping to manufacture the very cotton swabs that police all over Europe used for DNA testing. On any given shift, this woman would touch hundreds, maybe even thousands of these swabs with her bare hands. And in doing so, she would accidentally leave microscopic traces of her own DNA behind on each one. There was no international serial killer. There was no brilliant female criminal mastermind parading around the country. There was just a massive, years-long contamination issue. Police had been using cotton swabs that were already contaminated with this factory worker's DNA. And so, in essence, the police had wasted nearly 2 decades of work, millions and millions of euros, and thousands of hours of overtime chasing a criminal who didn't even exist. It was later determined that the police officer, Martin Arnold, and his partner, Michelle, were not attacked by some phantom killer. They were shot by 2 members of a neo-Nazi group. However, many of the other murders and serious crimes that had been attributed to the woman without a face over the years are still unsolved to this day, primarily because the police spent so long chasing the wrong suspect. Today, the case of the woman without a face is considered one of the biggest and most profound embarrassments in German police history. On the afternoon of the 2nd of May 1930, a middle-aged woman named Kim Soo-jin walked into her small farmhouse. She was in a village called Bongmyeon in what is now South Korea. She had spent the entire day working outside on her farm under the hot sun. All she wanted to do was get some water, sit down, and finally just rest for a moment. But before she could even do that, she heard a knock at her door. And even though she was exhausted, the sound of that knock actually energized her. She was almost certain that her 16-year-old son, Bak Chang-soo, had finally come home. Soo-jin and her son ran the farm together, just the 2 of them. They barely made any money doing it. In fact, a lot of the time, they didn't even grow enough food to feed themselves. So, to try to make ends meet, Soo-jin's son had recently started a full-time job at an inn in town. He also frequently picked up odd jobs around the village for extra cash. The problem was, Chang-soo would sometimes go straight from his job at the inn to one of those odd jobs, and he didn't always have time to stop by the farmhouse to tell his mother where he was going first. And this was 1,930 inches rural Korea. It wasn't like he could just call her on the phone. And so, this meant his mother was left to worry about him pretty frequently. And for the past 6 days, that is all Soo-jin had been doing. She had not seen or heard from her son at all. And even though he had gone for a few days at a time in the past, working these different odd jobs, a full week was a pretty long time for him to be gone without any word. But she kept telling herself what must have happened. He must have found some good work with a family who was having him live with them full-time. It was probably a great opportunity, and he had taken it. Surely, he would be home soon. And now, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, he was. So Soo-jin rushed to the front door. She pulled it open, but the hopeful smile on her face faded immediately. It was not her son standing on the doorstep. Instead, it was 2 police officers. The first thing they asked her was if she knew of any teenage boys who were missing from the village. Soo-jin told them that she had a son of her own who was a teenager. He was 16. And the reality was, she didn't know exactly where he was, and he had been gone for the past week. But she quickly added, "Don't worry, he isn't missing. He is very likely just working for a family somewhere, and he will be home soon." But after she said this, the police officers looked at Soo-jin with clear pity on their faces. They told her they were so sorry, but they were nearly certain that her son had been murdered. Soo-jin just stared at them in shock and disbelief. They explained to her that a few days ago, during the time her son was gone, a teenage boy's body had been found on a nearby mountain. An autopsy had been performed, and it showed he had been beaten and then strangled to death. For the last couple of days, the police had been traveling all over the village, interviewing people, trying to figure out who this poor boy was. And based on everything they had learned so far, Soo-jin's son, Chong-soo, was the only teenager in the entire area who wasn't accounted for. Hearing all of this, Soo-jin simply could not believe it was true. Her son was a good boy. He stayed out of trouble and worked incredibly hard. She couldn't imagine why anyone in the world would want to hurt him. So, she just told the police this has to be a mistake, but the police didn't seem to think so. They just said that they needed her to come with them to the local hospital morgue to identify the body. A little while later, Soo-jin arrived at the hospital with the two police officers. As they led her through the entrance, down a few long hallways, and towards the morgue, she kept telling herself over and over that her son was okay. He was still alive, and this was all just some kind of horrible, horrible mistake. It had to be. But the second she walked into the cold room of the morgue and saw the body lying on the metal table, her eyes welled up with tears. Because she knew, instantly, that it was her son. To Soo-jin, this moment felt like she had left real life and stepped into a nightmare. Her son's face and body were covered in bruises and wounds. He was clearly decomposing. It was an awful, traumatic thing for a mother to see. But as she stood there, staring down at a parent's worst nightmare, she noticed something strange. She turned to the police officers and told them that this was her son, definitely. But the clothes he was wearing were not his. And for some reason, to Soo-jin, this detail about the clothes felt very, very important. She started rattling off ideas for where they could have come from. It was like her brain had suddenly fixated on this one strange detail to avoid the overwhelming trauma of losing her son. She started telling the police that maybe the family he was working for let him borrow them. Or maybe he bought them without her knowing. Or maybe, she said, whoever killed him dressed him up in these clothes for some reason. But when she said that last part out loud, it was like the reality of her son being dead just came crashing down on her all at once. She started shaking uncontrollably, and before she knew it, she had collapsed onto the floor and was sobbing hysterically. Less than a week later, Soo-jin was sitting in her quiet farmhouse, staring out her front window in a daze, when she saw the police walking up the path towards her house again. Over the past few days, she hadn't heard any updates about her son's case. She had just been at the farmhouse, all alone, trying to make sense of his violent death. But now, seeing the officers, she went right outside to meet them. She asked them, "Do you have news for me about what happened to my son?" And they told her that she would likely want to sit down to hear this. Soo-jin figured it couldn't possibly be worse than finding out your son has been murdered. So she said, "Okay, let's go inside." They all went inside the farmhouse and sat down. And then the police told her that they had figured out who had killed her son. They told her they had not one, but two people in jail right now who had both given full confessions. Both of these suspects were people that Soo-jin's son, Chong-soo, had worked with Wei at the inn in town. One of them was a young man, and one was a young woman. Apparently, Chong-soo had gotten involved in the woman's personal life. She was having an affair with a married man, but was secretly planning to run away with a different man from the village. And Chong-soo had told the married man about her plan. When the woman found out that Chong-soo had exposed her secret, she was furious. So furious, in fact, that she conspired with her male co-worker, the other suspect, to get revenge. They lured Chong-soo out to the mountains under the guise of gathering wild vegetables. And then, when they got him out there, the man and the woman beat Chong-soo and then strangled him to death. This had all happened on the very first night that Chong-soo had left the farmhouse. So, over that 6-day period when his mother was worried, he was never living with another family and working for them. He was dead on the mountain the whole time. The police told Soo-jin that they had charged both suspects with murder. But after hearing all of this, Soo-jin still had one question. What about my son's clothes? She asked. Was there anything in the suspect's confessions about that? But the police just shook their heads no. They said the clothes didn't really seem relevant to the case anyway. And this time, even though Soo-jin still felt deep down that the clothes had to mean something, she didn't argue. She didn't try to come up with other theories. She just sort of accepted what the police had told her. As horrible as it was to know that her son was murdered over something so petty, she was at least glad to know that his killers were behind bars. Soo-jin eventually got her son's body from the police, and she was able to give him a proper burial in the local cemetery. And then, after that, she did her best to try to move on. But she never could. Every single night, she had the same terrible nightmare, replaying the moment she saw her son's body in the morgue. And as this nightmare kept happening, night after night, Soo-jin slowly became convinced that her son was haunting her dreams. She basically stopped sleeping. She couldn't really eat. She certainly couldn't work. Her farm fell into disrepair. She honestly began to think she was just going to wither away and die there unless something changed. She was overcome with grief and sadness, and she was also just plain scared. These dreams were terrifying. But then, on the night of the 18th of October, 1931, about 6 months after her son was killed, Soo-jin woke up from yet another nightmare. And when she opened her eyes, she saw a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed. She immediately realized that it was her son's ghost coming to visit her. But Soo-jin, she wasn't scared this time. She actually felt tears welling up in her eyes. And she just began speaking to the figure. She told the ghost, "I love you, but you have to move on. You have to rest in peace now. You have to." Soo-jin really didn't know what she expected to happen when she began speaking to the ghost. But what did happen was definitely not something she would have ever considered. Because suddenly, the ghost opened its mouth. And it spoke, and what the ghost said changed everything. It would turn out that Chong-soo, Soo-jin's son, had been viciously attacked by that man and woman up on the mountain. They really had beaten and strangled him and left him for dead. But he didn't die. He had survived the attack. And when he came to, he fled the area. He was terrified that if he went back home, they would find him and finish the job. So, he didn't have a chance to tell his mom that he was essentially on the run. And for 6 months, he lived in random towns doing odd jobs just to survive. But eventually, after 6 months, he missed his mom. He missed his home. So he went back. And he walked into her room in the middle of the night. He was the ghost she saw at the foot of her bed. And when she said to him, "You need to rest in peace now," he just said to his mom, "I'm not dead." He was just being honest. He was there. He was back. He had survived. It would turn out the body that was found on the mountain was just some other teenage boy who, by the way, was never identified. He just happened to be in the same area where Chong-soo had been attacked. And so when word got out about this body being found on the mountain, the man and the woman who had attacked Chong-soo immediately thought, "That's him. That was us." And so they confessed to killing him because that is what they had tried to do. They just didn't succeed. It was some other boy's body. And when Soo-jin went to the morgue and saw this body, it was decomposing and badly bruised, and in her grief, it looked like her son. And so she misidentified him. She thought it was her son, but it really wasn't. Her intuition had fixated on his clothes, and she knew something was off. Well, she was right. It wasn't her son, and those were someone else's clothes. In the end, the man and woman who had attacked Chong-soo had their murder charges dropped because they didn't actually commit a murder. They were both ultimately released from jail after serving about a year in prison for the assault. As for the actual person who was found dead on the mountain, that poor boy was never identified. He was buried in an unmarked grave, and over the years, the location of that grave has been lost to time. And so, even though we have the ability today to test for DNA, we are not able to exhume his body because we don't know where he is. And so, it is very likely we will never know who that person was. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. One morning in 2017, 25-year-old Watanabe Takuya walked through the front doors of Keio University Hospital in Tokyo, Japan. He wasn't panicking and he wasn't asking for help right away, but something about him immediately felt off. His skin was drenched in sweat from a fever. A deep headache pulsed behind his eyes with every step he took. And as he approached the check-in desk, he kept one hand tightly pressed against his right ear. Fluid was leaking from it. For most people, symptoms like that would have been terrifying. But Takuya mainly felt annoyed, because this wasn't the first time something like this had happened to him. Takuya had a long and difficult history with a condition known as cholesteatoma. It's basically a non-cancerous skin cyst that grows deep inside the ear canal, and it can cause a lot of problems if it's not treated. When Takuya was just a teenager, he'd had to go through multiple surgeries to get these cysts removed. The doctors had worked hard to make sure they got every last bit of it so it wouldn't come back. And for nearly a decade, it seemed like they had succeeded. The surgeries had worked. The cysts were gone, and he had been able to live a normal life without constant ear problems. But then, about 2 weeks before this hospital visit, the old, familiar symptoms started to return. He noticed a constant drainage coming out of his right ear. It was a clear sign that the cyst was back. Initially, Takuya had tried to ignore it. He was busy with work and life, and the idea of going back to the hospital, of possibly facing another surgery, was something he just didn't want to deal with. He put it off, hoping it might just clear up on its own, even though deep down he knew that was unlikely. But now, with the fever and the pounding headache, he couldn't deny it any longer. He was pretty sure the recurring cyst had caused him to develop a nasty ear infection. That would explain why he felt so sick. And so, here he was, back at the hospital, hand pressed to his ear, feeling frustrated with himself for waiting so long. He walked up to the check-in desk and explained his symptoms and his medical history to the receptionist. She listened patiently, nodded, and typed all his information into the computer. Seeing the state he was in, she quickly had him admitted to the emergency room. About half an hour passed. Takuya was now lying in a bed in the emergency room. The bright, sterile lights of the room were so intense they felt like they were stabbing into his eyes, making his headache even worse. So he just kept his eyes closed. But even with his eyes shut, he could hear the quiet sounds of the ER, and he sensed a doctor standing right beside his bed. He listened as the doctor began to go over the results of the initial tests they had run. The doctor's voice was calm and professional. He confirmed what Takuya had already suspected. Based on his medical history and the fluid clearly leaking from his ear, they were almost certain that his cyst had returned and had led to a severe ear infection. The doctor then mentioned that it was very likely Takuya would need another surgery to get rid of the cyst once and for all. But then the doctor's tone shifted slightly. He said they didn't want to operate just yet. There was a bigger, more immediate problem they had to deal with first. The preliminary blood tests had shown something alarming. The doctor explained that Takuya's ear infection had become so bad that the infection had actually started to spread to the tissue surrounding his brain. This was an extremely dangerous development. It could lead to meningitis, permanent brain damage, and even death if it wasn't treated aggressively and immediately. When Takuya heard this, his annoyance and frustration were instantly replaced by a cold wave of shock and fear. This was far more serious than he had ever imagined. But more than anything, he just felt angry at himself. He knew, with a sinking feeling, that if he had just come to the hospital 2 weeks ago when the drainage first started, the infection likely never would have gotten this bad. He had tried to avoid the problem, and now it had spiraled into something life-threatening. It was too late for regrets now. Takuya forced his eyes open, squinting against the painful light, and looked at the doctor. He asked what they could do. The doctor laid out the plan. They were going to admit him to the hospital, not just keep him in the ER, and start him immediately on a very powerful intravenous dose of antibiotics to fight the infection that was threatening his brain. 2 weeks later, Takuya was still a patient in the hospital. He was lying flat on his back, being slowly rolled into the large, white, donut-shaped ring of a CT machine. The machine would scan the inside of his head, giving the doctors a detailed picture of what was going on. By this point, the powerful antibiotics had done their job. The dangerous infection around his brain had been cured, his fever was gone, and his headache had finally subsided. He was feeling much better. But despite this progress, one symptom remained. His ear was still leaking fluid. It wasn't constant anymore, but it was still happening on and off, a sign that the root problem was still there. And so, the doctors had ordered this CT scan. Their goal was to look inside Takuya's head, pinpoint the exact location and size of the suspected cyst, and map out exactly how they were going to approach the surgery to remove it. Takuya laid perfectly still for about 5 minutes as the CT machine whirred and clicked around him, taking hundreds of images of his skull and brain. When it was finished, a nurse helped him out of the machine and led him back to his hospital room to wait. A little while later, one of the hospital doctors came into his room holding a folder with some papers inside. The doctor told Takuya that based on the results of the CT scan, he had some good news. Takuya actually didn't need another surgery on his ear. For a moment, Takuya felt a huge wave of relief wash over him. He had been mentally preparing himself for another operation, and the news that it wasn't necessary was incredible. But that happy feeling only lasted for a second. He saw the doctor's expression shift. The professional calm was gone, replaced by a deeply troubled look. The doctor then explained the reason why he didn't need surgery for a cyst. It was because there was no cyst in his ear at all. The real problem, the actual cause of all his symptoms, was something much, much worse. The doctor pulled an image from the stack of papers and handed it to Takuya. It was a cross-section from his CT scan. When Takuya looked at it, he could not believe what he was seeing. It would turn out Takuya had an extremely rare condition called Gorham-Stout disease, which is more commonly known as vanishing bone disease. It is a mysterious and devastating illness where the body's own systems, for no known reason, begin to break down and absorb its own bone tissue. In Takuya's case, the bones of his skull were literally disappearing, dissolving away almost like an ice cube melting in the sun. And that fluid that had been leaking out of his ear for weeks, it wasn't from an infection. It was cerebrospinal fluid, the fluid that cushions the brain, which was now flowing out through the holes that were forming in his skull. Unfortunately, then and now, there is no known cure for Gorham-Stout disease. The best doctors can do is try to manage the symptoms and patch the damage as it occurs. And that's exactly what they did for Takuya. Surgeons went in and used a special kind of biomedical glue to literally plug up the holes that were forming in his skull. Amazingly, the procedure seemed to work. Takuya's doctors monitored him closely for any further bone loss and fluid leakage. As of his most recent publicly released checkup in 2018, he appeared to be doing quite well. One afternoon in late January of 2018, a father named Dan Levitas stood inside the bathroom that his 3 kids shared in their house in Madison, Wisconsin. With a sigh of frustration, Dan grabbed his kids' toothbrushes from the holder by the sink and threw them straight into the garbage can. Then he picked up a bottle of disinfectant spray and went to work, spraying the counters, the sink, the faucet, the mirror, basically every single surface he could see, and began wiping everything down with paper towels. Dan was doing this deep clean because his entire family, himself, his wife, and their 3 young children all had strep throat. Their family doctor had explained that the best way to get rid of it for good was a 2-pronged attack. Everybody had to take a full course of antibiotics, and they had to deep clean the house from top to bottom to get rid of any lingering bacteria that might have caused the infection. However, as Dan scrubbed down the bathroom counters, he felt a deep sense of frustration. This was not the first time his family had gone through this exact routine. This was not the second or third time either. Over the past 4 months, his entire family had come down with strep throat a staggering 6 times. And no matter how many antibiotics they took, or how many times they threw out their toothbrushes and deep cleaned the entire house, it felt like the sickness always found a way to come back. It was a miserable, unending cycle. This was especially baffling to Dan because he was actually a biologist. He understood bacteria and how infections spread better than most people. He had already gone through a mental checklist of every possible source for this recurring infection. He checked at his own workplace and his wife's, but nobody else was getting sick. He checked with his kids' school and their daycare, and again, no other children or staff members were repeatedly getting strep. So he knew the infection couldn't be coming from any of those places. This just didn't make any sense. If the source wasn't outside the home, it had to be inside. But each of the 6 times they got sick, Dan and his wife had been incredibly thorough. They had systematically disinfected the entire house, going far beyond just the bathrooms. They cleaned every doorknob, every light switch, every toy, every surface they could think of. If there was strep bacteria hiding somewhere in the house, it surely should have been wiped out by now. It was as if the bacteria was somehow surviving their cleaning blitz, hiding in some place they had never thought to look. He just couldn't figure out where it could be. But regardless, Dan still dutifully finished disinfecting the bathroom for the 6th time. When he was done, he went to the kitchen. On the counter was a small pile of prescription bottles, antibiotics for the whole family. Dan took his own dose and then prepared the doses for everyone else. He went to his daughter's room first. His 2 girls, who were 6 and 3 years old, were both lying in their beds, looking completely miserable and flushed with fever. He gave them their medicine before heading to his and his wife's bedroom. He found his wife sitting up in bed, and she was cuddling their very sick 1-year-old son. Dan handed his wife her antibiotics and then looked down at his son. The little boy looked so small and so vulnerable, and it just broke Dan's heart to think about how many times this poor kid had been sick in his short life and how powerless he, as a father, felt to protect him. Dan felt like they were doing everything right. They were following the doctor's orders to the letter, but they were now on their 7th round of illness, and clearly nothing was changing. The advice they were getting wasn't helping. It felt like they were trapped in an awful nightmare they couldn't wake up from. But then, as Dan stood there feeling utterly defeated, he thought of something. His own mother was a retired pediatrician. She had decades of experience, and maybe, just maybe, she might have a different perspective or some advice that their current doctor hadn't considered. So, he sat down on the edge of the bed, took out his phone, and called his mom to explain the situation and ask for help. And it turned out Dan's mom did have a theory. It was a theory about where this relentless strep bacteria was coming from and how to finally get rid of it. But because Dan was a biologist and he understood how bacteria functioned on a scientific level, he knew that his mother's theory was, to put it mildly, out there. Most scientists and medical professionals would probably say that her idea was basically impossible. But at this point, after 6 bouts of strep throat, Dan and his family were desperate. They were ready to try anything, no matter how unconventional it seemed. So, Dan decided he would try to test his mother's theory. He began looking for an expert who could help him. But every expert Dan got in touch with, every lab and every doctor he called, turned him down as soon as they heard what his theory actually was. Nobody was prepared to even entertain the idea. It felt like he was so close to finding an answer, to finally curing his family of this horrible problem, but he was being blocked at every turn because the medical community wouldn't even consider it as a possibility. About a month later, in early March, Dan was inside a hospital room sitting next to his wife. They were both staring down at their 3-year-old daughter. She was lying in a hospital bed, looking tiny and frail, hooked up to an IV drip and wearing an oxygen mask. She had gotten strep throat for the 7th time. And this time, it was much worse. She had gotten so sick that she had also developed pneumonia. At this point, Dan and his wife weren't even sure if she was going to survive. For Dan, this was the absolute breaking point. He was on the verge of a complete breakdown. He was convinced that the only way to save his children was to find someone, anyone, who would be willing to test his mother's theory. but they had already been turned down by basically every expert in the entire state of Wisconsin. Dan had no idea who else to turn to. As they sat there in the tense silence of the hospital room, watching their little girl fight for her life, Dan's wife suddenly turned to him. She had an idea. What if, instead of asking established medical professionals for help, they tried asking medical students? Maybe a student, someone more open-minded and not so set in their ways, would be more willing to test out a theory, even if it did seem kind of crazy. Dan agreed. It was a long shot, a final Hail Mary, but it was definitely worth a try. They reached out to the University of Wisconsin, and this time their desperate plea actually worked. On the 4th of April 2018, about 6 months after the first strep outbreak in their house, Dan and his wife took one very specific thing from their home and brought it to the University of Wisconsin. The student they had contacted agreed to analyze it. And after the analysis was complete, the results determined that Dan and his family's crazy theory was correct. It would turn out that Dan, his wife, and their 3 kids were not the only ones in their home suffering from strep throat. There was actually a 6th victim, their pet cat. Now, most veterinarians at the time didn't believe that cats could even catch the specific strain of strep that affects humans, let alone transmit it back to them. That's why all the professionals had refused to even test the family's cat. It went against everything they had been taught. It was not until Dan contacted the University of Wisconsin's veterinary school that a student finally agreed to run the test. And lo and behold, the test came back positive for the exact same strain of strep bacteria that the family kept catching. Their beloved cat was the carrier, constantly reinfecting them after every round of antibiotics. Dan's 3-year-old daughter would go on to make a full recovery from her pneumonia. And after one final round of antibiotics, this time including a dose for the cat, and one last deep clean of the house, the family's nightmare with strep throat finally went away for good. On the 30th of September 1964, a 44-year-old woman named Charlotte Lawrence stood with her husband just outside the door to her parents' apartment in a little city in southwestern Germany. Charlotte took a deep, shaky breath, the key trembling slightly in her hand. Then she unlocked the door and stepped slowly into her parents' home. Charlotte was here because of a sudden and terrible tragedy. Both of her parents had passed away just a few days ago. They had only been 70 and 76 years old, and by all accounts, they had both been in good health for their age. The story she had been told was as shocking as it was tragic. Her father had apparently suffered a massive heart attack right in their kitchen. And then, when her mother found him, the shock of it all was so great that she also had a heart attack and collapsed beside him. Charlotte's mother had managed to make a call to a doctor just before she passed, but by the time the doctor arrived, it was too late. Both of them were gone. Now, Charlotte and her husband didn't live in Germany. They had flown in that morning all the way from their home in Wisconsin. And up until this point, Charlotte had been trying to hold her emotions together, to be strong through the travel and the initial arrangements. But now, standing inside her parents' living room, surrounded by all of their familiar belongings, the pictures on the wall, the furniture they had owned for years, it was like a dam inside of her just broke. All of the grief and shock she had been holding back just poured out of her, and she broke down completely, sobbing uncontrollably. Her husband, not really knowing what else to do, gently guided her over to the couch. He turned on the television to a quiet program, hoping it might be a small distraction, and told her to just sit down and rest for a bit before they had to think about dinner. They actually had plans that evening. The next-door neighbor, an elderly woman named Caroline, who had been friends with her parents for years, had offered to come over and cook dinner for them. Charlotte's uncle, Dear, who lived nearby, also planned to come over after dinner to be with them. About 30 minutes later, while Charlotte was still sitting on the couch, trying to compose herself while watching TV, Caroline, the neighbor, showed up at the door. She came in with 2 big bags full of groceries and, without any fuss, went right into the kitchen and began to cook. Pretty soon, the entire apartment, which had felt so empty and sad, was filled with the smell of comfort food cooking on the stove. It made Charlotte feel, admittedly, a little bit better. Eventually, Caroline called out from the kitchen that dinner was almost ready. So Charlotte got up from the couch, went into the kitchen, and sat down at the